Hey, welcome to the second episode of
Glorious Evolution.
a show about League of Legends rework ideas, and this one is all about the Fox Lady, Ahri. First of all, let me say that I think Ahri is already a reasonably well designed champion, and her popularity clearly shows that a lot of players really like how she currently is. Personally, I think she still has room for improvement, and that her gameplay could be even cooler, so that's why I'm doing this video. Before getting into the changes, let's talk a bit about Charm. This is an ability that fits perfectly well with Ahri's lore, but the rest of her kit does not synergize with it very well. I say this because the rest of her abilities don't reinforce the satisfaction of landing your CC as well as champions such as Lux, Nico or Zoe. Lux's Q guarantees you land your ult, which is very hard to hit otherwise, and rewards you with really high damage. Nico's E guarantees all procs of Q and sets up for an easy ult. And Zoe, after landing her sleep, gets an easy battle star from insane distances, also resulting in really high damage. In Ahri's case, you get to land both parts of Q, and that's mostly it. This interaction is okay, but it is only with one ability that is not hard to land, especially for a champion as mobile as Ahri. Additionally, notice that crowd control effects like roots still let your opponents fight back with attacks and abilities, so it makes sense for these champions to be really bursty. In Ahri's case, the charmed enemy can't retaliate for the duration, but she can't really make much use of it, because she can also dish out all her damage pretty quickly. The idea to make the charm CC more appealing starts with the W, Foxfire. The movement speed bonus on demand is something that feels great while playing Ahri, and it fits well with the idea that Ahri is an agile fox-like Vastaya. The actual Foxfire portion of the ability looks cool, but it has some room for improvement in terms of mechanics. Oftentimes, W is just a button that you click to increase the damage of your combo without thinking too much about it, and without adding much in terms of gameplay. Something else that I'm not a big fan of is how the damage is split up into 3 projectiles, but many times this does not matter that much since you often want all of them to hit the same enemy. The change to spice up the ability would be to make it required for Ahri to attack an enemy in order to make a flame fly out to them. I know this sounds like a huge nerf, but don't worry about that for now, just hear me out. This type of mechanic would make it so you would need to attack the target several times to get all the flames out, and this could be cool in 2 ways. Firstly, Ahri would make use of the powerful CC she has available, as she could use the time the opponent is charmed to safely get off some attacks. Secondly, nowadays you already tend to attack somewhat frequently as Ahri, either because you don't quite have the damage to kill a champion just with one rotation, or because you are waiting for the Ahri casts to become available. These attacks deal little damage, so they don't feel very satisfying, but if some of the damage from your rotation was backloaded into these, I think it could be positive for how our gameplay feels. We would clearly need to add some power back to the ability after this change, since we would just make the damage portion harder to use. Naturally, the damage of the ability could use some adjustments, but we'll talk about that in a bit. One other way to compensate for the change could be to have Ahri gain additional movement speed each time you would hit an enemy with an attack empowered by Foxfire. I like this because it expands on the idea that Ahri is a mobile champion even without her ultimate, and that as she keeps damaging her prey, she keeps getting excited to continue the chase. Additionally, it could make the identity of the ability clearer, further pushing it towards the mobility-focused basic ability. Remaining on the topic of the Foxfire mechanic, let's also look at Ahri's ult. The bolts this ability generates are thematically similar to the ones from the W, but in terms of gameplay they are considerably different. I think if these bolts were exactly the same kind of projectile, the kit would feel more cohesive and more appealing to players picking up Ahri, since it would simplify things in a way. To make this work, we could move the Foxfire generation mechanic to a passive effect. This could work similarly to Zoe's or Silas's passive, where each ability generates 1 stack of Foxfire, stacking up to 3, and each time Ahri would attack an enemy, 1 flame would also fly out to the target, dealing bonus damage. The ult would then be similar to today's version, but instead of firing up to 3 bolts to nearby enemies, it would simply be a dash. And obviously, each dash would trigger the W's passive, giving you 1 stack of Foxfire. As a note, this approach would remove the multi-target damage from the ult, but the idea is to remove a mechanic that takes up some of the kit's power budget to put it elsewhere and streamline the kit in a direction I feel makes more sense for Ahri, which is to focus on taking down a single target at a time. In this case, you would give up the multi-target damage for some potential movement speed bonus. Let's now go back to the damage each Foxfire projectile would deal. As of today, the damage is coded so subsequent flames deal less damage. I prefer the idea of all flames doing the same damage, but the damage should take into consideration that it would be replacing the current W damage and the R damage. Here are some numbers I came up with for the damage of one Foxfire projectile compared to the average value of one projectile of life W and R. These values would keep the damage somewhat close. However, since so far the changes make it harder to use the damage since you have to keep attacking, even with the compensation of the additional bonus movement speed, the damage can probably be more generous. So I thought of a 10% damage bump, which would lead to these other numbers. This increase is more meaningful in the late game, which I think makes sense since then it can be harder to attack enemy champions with all the teamfights going around. Okay, now let's take a quick detour for the passive, Essence Theft. Initially, I did not think a healing mechanic made much sense in a ranged assassin like Ahri, because if you are going to kill your enemies quickly and from some distance, health sustain does not seem very important. However, since part of the idea of the changes is to make Ahri need a bit more time to dish out the damage from a full combo, then a heal makes more sense, so she can survive a bit longer to finish off her target. This is also a pretty unique mechanic within champions of a similar class, so I think this is a difference that can be good to keep in the game. Not to mention that it is a mechanic that represents well how Ahri is empowered by the essence she drains from her victims. Despite this, I think the way Ahri currently gets healing is not the ideal fit. Farm and takedowns are the wrong triggers if the goal is to gain health during your attempt to kill an enemy. The idea here would be to have stacks generated each time Ahri would hit an enemy with an ability. At 3 stacks, her orb would glow green like it used to, and your next attack would consume the stacks to heal you. I like this since it puts even more emphasis on making your attacks feel rewarding, and it only works on champion combat, which I think is how most heals should work in the game. I also like the idea that if you are fighting multiple enemies, you are also more likely to hit several champions with Q, meaning you can trigger the passive slightly more often, which is obviously useful since you should also be taking more damage in that situation. I can't really say if this would be more or less healing than you have nowadays, but at least I think it is a more compelling way to get it. Alright, this is the last change, which is to how the ult would then interact with the updated passive. I would argue that Ahri's kit does not support being a reset champion too well, as Charm is a single target ability that has a fairly long cooldown, and even though the W can currently hit multiple champions, you often want to have all the projectiles hit the same target, as focusing your damage on one enemy is often ideal. Aside from this, I like the idea that Ahri can have access to a large number of dashes even if they are not all available as a baseline. The idea would then be to still allow Ahri to dash each time you would activate Essence Theft, but since the updated passive would likely trigger more often, the baseline number of dashes would only be 1. This way, looking at only one rotation of abilities, you would only be able to get 2 dashes off if you missed all your skill shots, but if you landed every ability, you could dash up to 4 times. Theoretically, you can keep this chain going infinitely if your abilities come back up, as long as you can stay in combat with enemy champions. The possibility of dashing an infinite number of times might seem ludicrously OP, but if you compare it with the current version, it is somewhat similar, as today you can keep getting more dashes as long as there are still enemy champions available to kill. Just to clarify, the idea is that you only get one refresh at a time, and you cannot stack multiple charges of the ult. This has the added benefit that it would no longer require the stack tracker below your mana bar, so this tracker could be used for the passive instead, and hopefully make both abilities clearer and easier to read, both for the player and for opponents. Because of the way it would work, you would not be able to dash multiple times without landing abilities and attacks in between, so the lockout between dashes would probably no longer be necessary. Combined with the W bonus movement speed, this would make Ahri really mobile if she is in combat, but not as much out of combat. I think this is cool for two reasons. First, you create clearer strengths and weaknesses for the champion, which is probably correct more often than not, and this also supports her lore in a cool way, as it would be like Ahri getting more excited and empowered during the hunt, as she drains life away from her foes. As a final note, I just want to point out that, incidentally, these changes could allow for some additional rune choice options. Ale of Blades could probably become a viable option for Ahri, as it would allow you to get Foxfire projectiles out quicker, and, since not a lot of mages can currently use Ale of Blades effectively, this could be interesting. Predator could also be an appealing option, since you would have no problem sticking to the target, but you would not be as strong as reaching the must day. This isn't a big deal, but more viable rune choices is definitely always a positive. Well, that's it. Hope you liked some of the ideas. Just as a remark, I want to let you know that I have not played the Ruined King game yet, but from what I saw in the teasers, it looks like Ahri has some really cool looking abilities there, so there is probably a lot of inspiration that can be drawn from that. If you would like to see me revisit this rework after I played the game, let me know in the comments. Thank you so much for watching, leave a like if you want to make me happy, and don't forget to subscribe if you want to get notified about future videos. See you next time as we continue on the path to the
glorious evolution.